You may recall the horrific stories of physical, mental, and sexual abuse that took place over the years at the state-run Dozier School for Boys in Marianna, Florida. Joining us now is a relative of one of the boys from the Dozier School. Tanana Dew, welcome to Legal Connections.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
So tell us about your relative and how you found out he was involved in the Dozier School.
Absolutely. My late mother, Patricia Stevens Dew, is from Florida A&M University graduate, as a matter of fact. And after she passed away, within just a few months, we got a call from the Florida Attorney General's office, or Florida State Attorney's office, telling us that she might have had a relative buried on the grounds of the Dozier School, which at the time I had never heard of. This was back in 2013. I did not know anything about the Dozier School, but we were grieving my mother. So my father, Attorney John Dorsey Dew Jr., who's a FAMU Law School graduate, as a matter of fact, and I went to Marianna to a meeting where Aaron Kimmerly from the University of South Florida had gathered some survivors, black and white. It was a segregated facility, who told just the most horrific stories, almost casually, not casually in the sense that it had not impacted them late into life, because many of those young men were traumatized for life, but casually in the sense that they were the same stories, of beatings, like a beating so bad that they would tear off your skin and take you to the infirmary. The doctor had to remove your clothing from the wounds and that kind of stuff. These are children. So I knew immediately I had to write about it because Robert Stevens, who was my mother's uncle, died there in 1937. And I wanted to honor him, but also to give him a different story.
And do you know what happened to your great uncle there?
The story is, and I say that only because I don't trust the record keeping at all, but the story is that he was stabbed to death by another inmate there, and according to the records, he did get charged for the death of Robert Stevens. But again, there's so much of a shroud of mystery around it because the reports when children died were, sometimes suspicious. And I could take it at face value, but in any case, they were both prisoners, and they were both at this terrible facility. And even if his death was the fault of another child there, overall, I consider the Dozier School itself to be to blame.
And out of this tragedy comes an opportunity for you to write about it in your book, The Reformatory. Tell us about the book.
Well, as a former journalist for the Miami Herald and someone who had already co-written a memoir with my mother, Freedom in the Family, a mother-daughter memoir of the fight for civil rights, I did think for a hot minute about writing it as nonfiction, like really sort of researching the life and death of Robert Stevens and bring the whole thing to light. But to be honest, for a couple reasons. Number one, there already were so many great memoirs from actual survivors, quite feel like my lane. And secondly, to be honest, I'm a fiction writer and I'm a horror writer, and it really presented itself in my imagination as a horror story. But in a weird way, I could actually soften it by making it fantastical, right? It's not I mean, yes, racism is one of the monsters in this story. Jim Crow is one of the monsters in this story. There are human monsters in this story. But by adding the fantasy element of ghosts, which I call haints, and making it a horror novel, it could sort of metaphorically pay homage to the deaths at this facility without me having to like write child after child after child getting killed, which did not appeal to me.
My Texas-born mother introduced me to the whole concept of haints, so I understand that concept.
Yeah.
So what would you like readers to take away from this book?
I decided as I was working on the reformatory that it really wasn't enough just to tell one child's story. The Robert Stevens in this story, and I said it in 1950 instead of the 1930s because I know that era better from my mother's stories, right? So that's why I picked 1950. I intentionally chose a moment that was prior to the lynching of Emmett Till, prior prior to the beginning of the bus boycotts and what we know as the modern civil rights era, but also paying homage to real life figures like Harry T. Moore and Harriet Moore, who were blown up, I would imagine by the Klan, even though people weren't, obviously no one was brought to justice for that. But I wanted to make it a microcosm so people could learn what it was like to be a young black person in Jim Crow Florida, how careful you had to be, how frightening just everyday encounters could be. I wanted readers, black and white, to just get that, this is what our people were going through. And also, frankly, looking at mass incarceration, because the reformatory, much like the real life Dozier School, was a huge part of the local economy in Mariana. So when you talk about, corporations being too big to fail, I think that is the reason, even though this real life facility was flooded with complaints throughout the time it was operating. It operated from about 1900 till 2011. And I think that's because it was such a huge part of the economy. So many people worked there. Historically, corn crops were grown there. It had the printing press for the town was there. Just about everybody went through those doors at some point as an employee. So it's tough to close a facility down. And that's very similar to where we are. Even if you just look at juvenile so-called justice, there are alternatives to putting children in cages. And a lot of the issues in the reformatory in 1950 still hold true today. One example being the school to prison pipeline, which I would argue is even worse in 2024 than it was in 1950, because there are way more people incarcerated today than there were in 1950. So I wanted people to understand how horrible and lonely it is as a parent when the system decides it's going to take your child out of your home, put them in chains, and put them in a cage. And that's what I call being handcuffed and being incarcerated. You're in chains and you're in a cage. And that hasn't changed. I mean, if that happens to you, you may have some money and means and you can get them out and you can get a lawyer, but you have still been subjected to this dehumanization and trauma that happens when you've lost control of your family. And the system has your child in their hands. And unfortunately, children still do get hurt and assaulted, and statistically more often by guards than by the other children.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story and also just shedding a light on what has happened and what could happen if we are not vigilant and protecting our children. So thank you very much for being with us, Tananarive Due.
Oh, absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.
And for more information, please visit tananarivedue.com.